This here is of course DAZ Studio, and let's begin with the whole Iray Server integration. So Iray Server is a standalone renderer for, well, the Iray engine. It can be used with DAZ Studio, but also with other applications. So it's one of those things, you don't have to use it with DAZ Studio, but you can. And if you've ever poked into DAZ Studio a little bit, you know where to find it. It is on the Render Settings tab. If you head over to the advanced settings, you will find these three ominous little tabs here. One's called hardware. That's your local hardware. So I have a CPU and I have two GPUs in my computer here. Then there's this canvases thing. I've explained that in another video in which you can use Iray to use multiple render passes, which is kind of cool. But then you have this third thing here that's called bridge. And that's really where this whole Iray Server thing can connect with. So in bridge, you have this connection here, Iray Server, or you have a visual computing appliance, VCA. We don't use that, but Iray Server. That is basically the standalone version of Iray that doesn't need anything else. It just needs a kind of a baked out file that DAZ Studio can provide. It and many other 3D applications can do that. And then you can give it to the standalone renderer, and then Iray Server will take care of making this, turning this into a picture. This is a little bit, this is a bit like the 3D Light standalone renderer. There's something called a RIB file, if you've ever heard that, RIB file. That is something that DAZ Studio can basically save out whatever's in the viewport, and as you're seeing, you can save that out as a, well, I wouldn't say flat file, but a collection of files, and you can then give that to a standalone 3D Light renderer while you do something else with DAZ Studio. So that's the idea. This is where we connect it. We need an IP address for our server. We also need access credentials for the server, and then whatever's in the viewport can be added to a queue, and the queue is then being processed on the Iray server, and you can use DAZ Studio for something else. There we go. Mr. Jeremy, top of the morning to you. Very good to see you. 5:10 in the morning. That is early indeed. But other than these credentials here, if you've looked at this in DAZ Studio, it might be a little bit ominous. Like, where do we even go with that? What is Iray Server? Is that a box, or what is it? Well, you can download it if you fancy on a website called irayplugins.com. And that is something that's not actually NVIDIA's website. That is the website of a company called Siemens, and they're looking after Iray now. So NVIDIA have actually divested themselves of the Iray render engine. Somebody else is taking care of that, and that's these people at Siemens or Lightworks. If you scroll to the bottom here, you can in fact see their address, Siemens Industry Software Limited, in the Barracks House in Hillsborough Barracks in Sheffield, which is exciting. And they have several bits and pieces to offer. One of them is, of course, the Iray Server, which I thought I would see here. Oh, there we go. This is it here, Iray Server. If you click on that, you will go and see what it's all about. It's network rendering with this application. You can try it out for free for 30 days, which is what I've done, or you can also buy it. There's two versions available. One is $300, I think. That works on that's kind of that. I think there's two versions, $300 and $400, I think. One's a floating license, one's not a floating license. Don't really know the exact difference. But if you go and fill this out, you can get yourself a trial version of that for 30 days. And it tells you all about it here. I'll put a link of this website in the description of this video, and they'll send you an email with which you can download about a 1 gigabyte file, and that you can install. That will do two things. That will install two things on the hardware that you'd like to run Iray Server on. That can be either your local computer, or that can be a computer that you're running on your network. It can be one on the internet as well. But I'm using one that runs on my local network here, so only I can access it. But I could run it in the cloud, and then other people from all around the world could access it and submit jobs to it. You can also run Iray Server on your local desktop, so you don't need two separate computers for it. You can still reap benefits by sending something to basically a background application that runs on the same computer that you're using DAZ Studio on, and just send it there. It's a bit like the Poser render queue. That's how that works. But you can also, the cool thing is you can also string multiple computers with multiple GPUs together. So in my setup here, I have 4 computers. Not all of them are on at the moment, so I'll demonstrate this with my main desktop and one remote node. But I have two other computers that are also running Iray Server, and each GPU and each CPU can contribute to the render pool and therefore get images rendered faster. That's how that works. Let's see how it looks. We'll see what it does. On this other computer on which I've got it running, this is what will be installed. So there's one little icon on the desktop. You don't have to use the desktop icons, but it does this by default. And I had a little bit of tweaking to do in order to get these things on there. It comes with a PDF guide. You can read that. Iray Server activation, we don't really need to worry about. It comes with one icon, I think. And if you double click that, it'll launch the standalone version of Iray Server. And that's just a command line tool that gets kicked off, and it'll just go and run that server. It will also then provide a web interface that we'll have a look at in a minute. And a second one is essentially the same command with different parameters. I'll talk to you about that later. That is the Iray Server cluster. So that means you have one server running and other computers on the network connect to that server, and each of them will contribute GPUs. So on this here, I'm going to double click that, the standalone version, and it comes up with this exciting little hacker window here. I always like reading things like this. It goes through all kinds of bits and pieces, and eventually will hopefully start the server and accept incoming requests. That's what this is all about. So while this doodles, I can show you what else you need to do. Oh yeah, this is the first thing that it says here. To get started with Iray Server, web interface, open a web browser, type in this IP address here, and then enter your credentials to sign in. So this here is the local loopback IP address of this machine, but it's not the one that you need to access it from another computer. You can use it to access it from here, but you can't use it from another computer. To find that out, you're going to have to query what IP address your current computer has, the one that's running Iray Server. So in my case, I can go down here. It's a Windows machine, of course. I can, no, actually I'm going here. This is the thing, network, and I'll go and click on that. That'll give me a little network window that tells me which of my networks is connected. So I'll click that, and if you scroll down here, you will see the actual IP address of your computer on the network. This one is one to remember. So in my case, it's 10.01.123. That's the one on which Iray Server runs. And with it, I can now essentially just leave this open and go back to my main desktop computer and type that number into a web browser. It's kind of cool. Let's try this out. So it was 10.0123, and then there's a colon, and then you have to put in the port number, which is 9090, and then that'll do the trick. VPN will not be an issue. No, I'm using VPN here as well. That is not an issue. When I click that, it goes and comes up with this, which is kind of exciting. So this is the web server for the web interface of Iray Server that runs on my other computer. And this is how I can log into it. This is kind of cool. This is also how DAZ Studio will log into it. So you need to remember this IP address there. And it'll be different on your system. But yeah, VPN is not going to be an issue, which is great. I'm going to log in as admin. I've forgotten what the default password is. It tells you in the documentation. I will dig it out and put it in the description. And when I do that, I can see the web interface of Iray Server. These are all finished jobs. The queue isn't currently running, so it's not accepting anything, or it won't process anything if I send something to it. But this is what it looks like for now. I don't think I need this anymore. I'm going to go and clear this all out. And just go and clear all jobs out. Perfect. Empty. I like it. On the left-hand side here, you've got a bit of a sidebar menu. You've got some results here. These are previous renders that I've done, and I can look at them as well. So this is kind of cool. You can go and see what has been done on your server. You can go and click this. This little window gives you a summary of what's happened here, what it was, like a photoreal render, and what the size was. And to a certain extent, you can override these settings directly on the server. It tells you how long it took, and then you can also look at the actual picture that it produced. You can also download the picture from the web interface. So that's kind of cool. If your Iray Server is somewhere in the cloud and you have to go and send something to it, then you have to get the rendered result back, and that is so it provides that as well. You can go and save this image. It also offers to make zip files of the whole thing, so you only download one zip file. That's kind of cool. And then there we go. It also tells you what was rendered. So the beauty is the thing we see. The other render passes are called other things. If you're familiar with the Iray canvases, those would show up here. results, then we have archived things. Those are things I don't need anymore. And here we have resources, which is probably an exciting thing if you have multiple render nodes connected to Iray Server. This window down here is the same that we saw in the black window that runs on the actual server. Like this. This is an exact duplicate of it, in case you ever needed to see what's happening here. So in this window, I can now see that a user named admin has just logged in and he's cleared 9 jobs. So, you know, it basically status messages that we see here. Kind of cool. Users, you can have multiple users, so an admin is the default, but if other people were to use your Iray server, you have other people here. It's kind of cool. There's other settings here that tell you what kinds of features you want enabled with this. Also, if you want to store things as zip files or not, and so forth. So that is all set here. So this is kind of how you use Iray Server. You just use the web interface and do this thing. Now, how does this relate to DAZ Studio, and how do we send jobs over there? It's actually fairly simple. If I go and if I go and use DAZ Studio and make myself a little scene here, maybe with a primitive. Let's start with something simple, perhaps a cylinder, or maybe a larger cylinder. How's that? Maybe a cube. I think that's a good idea. Let's do the default cube, a la Blender. Let's do that. 1 meter cube. I like it. Here it is. That's a good start. And maybe we'll give it a color so that we feel at least like we've done something. So maybe we'll do, make it a green cube, and then also frame it up nicely. And we don't worry about the lighting. This is our picture now. This is like awesome now. Mr. Rod, I'm good. Very good to see you, buddy. I'm just about to send a picture over to Iray Server. You're just on time. So here's what we do now. We go to the render settings tab, and then on the bridge tab here, so under advanced and then bridge, we go ahead and hack in the same details that I had hacked in earlier into my web server. So this is also how DAZ Studio connects with Iray Server. So this is my IP address, this is the port number, and because I didn't do anything about certificates, I need to untick the secure box, otherwise there's no connection there. I also need to give it my username and password. That's either the admin, that's the default one that's set up, or something else. I'm just going to use admin for this, and then I go and don't hit add to queue, I'm going to hit connect, and that now will let DAZ Studio essentially go and connect to the server. If we go and switch over to that log file that I've shown you there, which is somewhere here, it should show me that as well. Was it in archive? Was it in settings? Was it in somewhere? Was it in resources? Resources, wasn't it? There we go. Successfully authenticated user admin. So the thing knows DAZ Studio has successfully logged in. And also DAZ Studio hasn't freaked out, which is a good thing. So now, instead of hitting the render button, which would render this picture on my local computer, maybe with render settings, I might go and specify 200 samples. That's a good start. We're going to use the denoiser. And we're going to use something, fairly, maybe not quite that large. Maybe as a test, we'll just go use this. So usually I'd hit the render button, and that would send over this thing to my GPUs. My GPUs would start spinning, and eventually I'd see a rendered picture. If you want to render something with Iray Server, you hit the Add to Queue button. And when you do that, this is kind of fascinating what happens then. It will ask you for a job name, and we're going to give this call, test cube, perhaps green test cube. So you always have to give it a name and then hit accept, and then DAZ Studio will essentially go and assemble all the bits and pieces that are necessary for this thing to render, and we'll just go send it over to the server. And that is the end of DAZ Studio's involvement. So you can now go ahead and spin your viewport over again. It's not blocked while you're waiting for this render to happen. It's now sent to the server. The server can now go ahead and do this thing, while we could set up another shot or different render settings that we might want to try, a different camera that we want to set up, or we want to go and set up our next scene. That's kind of how this works. So meanwhile, on Iray Server, we go and have a look at the queue. So the queue says, hey, there's a new job in here, which is called green test cube. That's kind of cool. The queue isn't currently running, so I need to start it, but I only have to start this once. I can start it or stop it. The moment I do this, anything that is currently attached hardware-wise to the Iray server will be used for rendering. So I only have 2 GTX 970 cards in here, and you know, for 200 samples this is going to work fairly fast on those 2 cards. And we'll have a look at how I can involve my local and my remote cards together as a cluster in a moment. But this is essentially how this works. The job has been processed, and here it is. I can now click on it and see this is my my rendered result. It's kind of awesome. It tells me everything that happened here. Took what did it take? 200 iterations. It took exactly 4 seconds to render this, so it's not bad. Whoops, there we go. And this is the picture. So I can click on it and go, hey, that's awesome, and I go and save it somewhere if I want to do that. So that's how the principle works. If I go and send something else over that might take longer to render, we can go and have a look at the progress bar and see how this render will become faster. So the cool thing is, once the queue is running, so it's still running the queue and it's still waiting for incoming jobs. If I wanted to go and put another, maybe like a top view of my cube in here, I can just go and do that, add to queue, call it top view, hit accept, and, you know, do something else. So go set up my next shot. Maybe, you know, this is my front view, maybe it's, because that looks so exciting. Add to queue and say front view. So you can see how this is a nice handy tool to speed up workflow, even if you had Iray Server running on the local system. So meanwhile, in the background, these 2 jobs have now been finished. This is kind of cool. And as I said, these render really fast because they're just simple scenes that I've set up. If I wanted to do something like change my render settings, I don't have to go back to DAZ Studio. This is also cool. So imagine I'm thinking, hey, my green test cube was in fact so cool that I'd like to re-render it. I believe I can do that somehow, namely with this little button here. So I can go and copy this job, doing that, and I'll call it something else. So everything has to have a unique name. So green test cube, that job already exists, so I need to call it something else, green test cube 2 perhaps. And I can go and render this in higher resolution, so maybe I'll say 1920 by 1080. And perhaps I don't want this to be rendered in 200 iterations. Maybe I want to have like a really high-res version and make it 2000 iterations. And then I can go and add it to the queue directly from here. This is kind of cool. And that gets submitted directly from the server to the server, just with different render settings. And, you know, it goes on and does its thing. This is kind of cool so far. So I was impressed by how this works, and we'll look at this with a different picture in a minute, and we'll see how we can add other computers to the same server as well, so that we operate as a cluster. But yes, this is how it works. Kind of neat, huh? If you stop the queue, then any jobs that come in now won't be submitted. So I could go and, you know, copy this and call it test cube number 3. And if I do that, this job will just wait until this first job is finished, and then it'll go do the third one. But if I stop the queue, then that won't be you know, executed, which is kind of cool. All right, so this is how the basic principle works. Let's go and load a real scene and send that over, because that takes, you know, a lot longer to render. Actually, maybe not. Maybe we'll just stay with my green cube here, and I'll show you this other thing that I was quite fascinated by. What happens if you have multiple computers and multiple GPUs with multiple computers, and how do you connect those to Iray Server? So what I've shown you so far in order starting the server, that is the so-called standalone version. You have one Iray Server, and you have some kind of client that sends data to it, and then the server processes it. But the hardware that's necessary to make that happen is in fact the thing that runs Iray Server. So no matter if it's one computer or if it's 2 computers, you currently only have one set of hardware that does the job. If I wanted to use this computer, my desktop computer, or my desktop computer's GPUs to render the image as well, I can do that, but I need to start the Iray Server in a different mode, namely in clustered mode. Let's have a look at that next, and then we'll go and carry on with the cubes here. So for now, queue stopped. That's all. It's basically finished here. That's all cool. I'm going to leave everything as it is and just go and stop the server. That doesn't happen here. That happens, of course, on my other computer. And it's fairly easy to do it. All I need to do is close this window down. And if I do that, it just goes and, shuts the server down, gives me some messages, and essentially, that's that. Sadly, what also happens, and it's also a good thing that I'm showing you this, DAZ Studio will now crash because I hadn't disconnected DAZ Studio from Iray Server. Here, there we go, that's the error message. DAZ Studio has encountered a fatal error and, must close, which is a bit of a shame. That's because I didn't disconnect Iray Server. Should have thought about that. So, yeah, that's one of those things. Just something to keep in mind. Our wonderful scene of the green cube is now forever lost, which is a shame. The server is also not running, so I'm getting an error message. That's perfectly fine. There's just no service running on my other computer. This is Iray's way, or the Iray server's way of telling me this. So let's go back to this computer. This was the Iray standalone server. If I double click that, same would happen as before. If I wanted to start my server in cluster mode, then it means it needs to listen to other computers that might want to connect to it. So this is going to be the server, and my other computer from which I'm running DAZ Studio is going to be one part of the cluster. It'll be one node, it'll be one slave that'll connect to this Iray server, but it won't then accept jobs. Only on a server setup, Iray like nodes kind of master slave setup, only the master server will receive the jobs, and the other guys will just suck up to him and process the jobs with him, but they won't receive the jobs. So what we need to do is essentially make a copy of the previous one, which is the standalone thing. Make a copy of this thing, and under properties there's a couple of things that need to be set for this to start properly. So under target, you just have the regular path of the Iray server command. At the end here, outside the what do they call it, the quotation marks, you have to put separated with a space -C. That tells Iray server I want to start in cluster mode, and then you give it an IP address of the master node, followed by -M, and that tells the node that this is the master. So C means cluster mode, then followed by that the IP of whatever the master is, followed by -M. And that will now start Iray server slightly differently. And if I do that, you will see that all our previous jobs have disappeared. So they're not in the queue anymore, because it's now a different mode, and Iray server sees that as something very different. We need to wait for this to start, and then we can start the cluster on my main machine as well, so that it can connect with all its processing power. And that'll take a couple of minutes here. When you install Iray server, no matter on which machine, it'll come up with 7 or 8 firewall exceptions. So you have to accept them all. Make sure you do that. There we go. I think this has done it now. It tells me I can log in. There's more there's more messages that'll pop in here, but I'll see if my main computer can read the interface now. Let's see. Well, that's its IP address again, :1990 for the port. There we go. We're back. Let me go log in. Oh, there we go. Everything's still on there. That's perfect. Oh, that's good. That's good to know. Green test cube jobs are still in here. That is very, very cool. If I go under settings now, was it settings? No, it was under resources. There we go. It now tells me that my current host is one of my computers, the Z840. It has 48 gigabytes of RAM, it has 48 CPU cores, and it has 2 GPUs. I can also go and open that. It tells me what GPUs those are, and I can choose if I should use the CPU on that machine as well or not, or which GPUs I want to use on that system. So I can enable and disable resources on that remote system as I see fit. So that also works in the standalone version. It's just if you want to have one GPU for Iray server and another one for something else, you can do that. If you prefer to use or not use the CPU, it's your choice. I choose to disable it because it doesn't really add much to the whole rendering thing. It just adds a lot of heat to the room and not a lot of speed to the render time. But this is all we see. We see one computer here, and that's the Iray master, which is cool. Now let me go and do the same thing on my main computer. So this is my main desktop. This one here is the Iray server computer. So main desktop will also be started in Iray cluster mode, and it'll give me a very similar display, but the difference here is the parameters with which it is started. So this one has exactly the same as before, -C and the IP address of the master, but it doesn't have the -M, and that tells Iray Server that this is not the master. This is a different computer, and therefore it defaults to a slave. And it will go and search the network and look around and hopefully at one point connect to the master in the background. Let's see if that is actually the case, shall we? And that should be here under the resources. In fact, that has happened. Look at that. So the master was the one I showed you earlier. That's the Z840. And now another computer has connected to the Iray server, which is the Z800. So those are my two workstations. Z840, that's over there. And actually, this is Z800 is also over there. But it has different configuration. So I've also disabled the CPU here. I've got my two RTX 2080 cards, whereas here I have two GTX 970 cards. So these are now 4 GPUs that are working together rendering a picture, which is exciting. So if we go and submit a job again, we can either submit it again or we can go back to our queue and go and submit this one again here, the green cube number 3. Let me go and re-queue that and call that green cube cluster. We use the same render settings, so 2000 iterations and the same size, and I'll just go and hit add to queue, and then of course I need to start the queue, and now 4 GPUs are going to work together via the network. And so the data was still on the server. I could just reutilize it and re-queue the job, and it will hopefully be much faster. So what is working in our advantage here is that the data that needs to be distributed is rather small. So if you had something that is rather large, like a large scene that has a lot of assets, they would all need to be shuffled over the network and arrive on all nodes that are, that are participating in this rendering process. But given that hopefully the network connection is fast enough to make that a viable thing. So yes, that's just something to be aware of. Let's have a look at the render speed here. So the cluster render speed reckons it has happened in 24 seconds, whereas the one that didn't use the RTX 2080 cards, that's this one here, that was hopefully a little bit, did take a little bit longer. There we go, 1 minute and 7 seconds. So with more GPUs, you get a faster render time, which is exciting. Same rules apply as in DAZ Studio. Everything needs to fit into the GPU's RAM. If it doesn't, if I had a scene that exceeds the memory of my GTX 970 cards, then only the RTX 2080s and the CPUs will participate, and the GTX 970s will say, sorry, can't render that, and they won't participate in the whole process. Interesting, isn't it? So that is that. That's kind of cool. Let's go and send another scene over from DAZ Studio, which is hopefully not going to crash this time. It happens when you shut down Iray Server and you haven't disconnected DAZ Studio. It just goes and crashes. So I'll send something over that is a bit larger, and we'll see how long that takes to render. I'm just going to go and make the depth of field a little bit shallower here. I might use 12. And this is our jump guy. We've built him in a previous episode live. I think that was when I was explaining how to make a bokeh effect. I think that should look good. Let me just go have a look from the top here and see if I have the camera plane correct. Hello, there we go. Camera's this. Camera plane's good. Okay, we're all good. Just checking. So let's see what the render settings are on this puppy. It is 2000. I like that. 2000 is a decent amount. And we're using denoiser as well. That's all good. Let's go and not hit render on this. Or maybe that is something else we can try. We can tweak the local render versus cluster render. Let's do that. For that, I'll use a few less iterations. Let's just use 500. And size is a bit too much, isn't it? Let's go with 1920 by 1080 again. And let's go and save this first of all. And I'm going to go and render this locally just with my current GPUs here. That will give us a time, and that'll tell us, you know, what the two RTX cards do by themselves and how long it'll render with helped by two GTX 970 cards. You know, they're not that bad. They're just a few years older, and I figured out that I think two 970s combined render kind of as fast as one 2080, I think. Almost, not quite. But it certainly is a help, so that's quite nice. It's just about 45 seconds, wasn't it? The accurate time is in the log. At the very bottom, it'll tell you exactly how long Iray thought this was. 44.1 seconds. That was it, 44.1 seconds. So let's do the same thing with the Iray Server now. And once again, we go under Advanced, we go under Bridge, and we go and connect ourselves to the Iray Server. Iray Server should be happy with that. And then we're going to go and add this to the queue. And we're going to call that Jump Guy. Adds it to the queue, and this takes a little longer because it has to package all the assets that we're using. So it doesn't send the raw assets over. It will build something that is readable by Iray Server. And depending on how much that is, so in my case, it's about 2.7 gigabytes. So it should fit into the GTX 970's memory. So this is how long it takes on a kind of a small scene to send everything over. But now we're done. I'm not going to keep this. And we'll go over to Iray Server again, which is already running on two clusters. Currently, it appears nothing's happening, but that's because it still distributes data around the network. I have a gigabit LAN, so it should be fairly fast, but it will be, there is a time amount involved in that, just to let you know. And then at one point it will start rendering automatically. So there's one issue, not with Iray Server, but with the way that it's integrated into DAZ Studio, and that is that sadly it doesn't do animations, and that is something that is just super sad. Oh, there we go. Fastest frame is actually 52 seconds, so it actually took longer to render this in Iray Server, but I suppose if you had a scene that would take, like, say 10 minutes on your local machine, that would actually be faster, because at that point you'll reap the benefits of actually rendering versus sending the data over. So that's what my tests show anyway. There's a public Patreon post that I've made, I'm going to link to, that you can read with my discoveries about render times. So it does actually scale up really nicely, but it does also depend on how much data is in your scene to begin with. But it's a great way to offload this from DAZ Studio, not block DAZ Studio. And if you don't want to render with a second instance of DAZ Studio, you can just go and send this all to Iray Server. So that's fairly cool. But there's an issue with the way Iray Server is integrated into DAZ Studio, and that's animations. And this is really what I was looking forward to, and I was very bummed about learning that hey, animations are currently not supported. Not by Iray Server, mind you. Iray Server can handle animations, but DAZ Studio can't handle sending it over to Iray Server, which is uncool. Let's demonstrate. Let's go get ourselves a primitive. Something maybe like a cube, maybe like a sphere. I like the sphere. Let's go with a sphere. Sphere is here. Awesome stuff. Let's give sphere color. I like having things having colors rather than being gray and stuff. Let's go and make that happen. And I'll make the awesome jumping animation. So I'll go and put a keyframe on frame 0, and I'll go and put another keyframe on frame 30, and then perhaps at frame 15, you've guessed it, ball goes up in the air, like so. Awesome stuff. As a result, if I go and move the playhead, it'll go up and down and up and down. It's all good. So if I go and let's say I don't need to make myself a camera. It's just, you know, I can use the viewport just like we know and love it from DAZ Studio. Let's just say this is my ultra awesome framing here. I can see that the ball goes up and down. That's all cool. So if I go and try and render an animation, I go back to render settings, and I'll just go and send this over to the queue. I can say ball, I don't know, I'll just say ball animation, I'll just call it, because I would imagine it'll go and send over 30 frames. It will actually, on my Normally, if I were to render this out here, I have to tell this to do something either like image series, and then, you know, render frame 0 to 30 and where it needs to go. If I use this, there's no such option. So I'll go and do this anyway, and I'll say ball animation. Did I spell this correctly? Animation accept. It'll go and send this over, and it should really send the whole animation over, but as you can see, what arrives is one frame of the animation, and it happens to be the frame on which I'm parked. So if I go and look at that now, it will be the ball in its, you know, in its down position, and it only has rendered a single frame. It hasn't rendered multiple frames, even though Iray Server quite clearly could support that. DAZ Studio does not support that, and that's a real shame. Thankfully, I can park my playhead somewhere else. So let's say on frame 15, and add this to the queue, frame 15, accept, and then hit that over. And even though it's a separate job, and it will render that frame, it will render frame 15, it is not, you know, an image sequence unless I submit every single frame separately, which means sending over all the data for the scene as many times as there are frames in the animation. So it's not ideal, but a clever scripter / coder potentially could come up with something that would make that happen. So that is, you know, that's a possibility. It's not an elegant solution because I don't know how many of these things are implemented in the scripting API. Perhaps it's better suited for a plugin, or actually perhaps it's even better suited if this would get fixed in the current implementation of DAZ Studio. But yes, that is essentially all I have. Oh, there's one other thing that I can show you, and that's only available with the cluster version, but it doesn't quite come up at the moment. It's this thing here. There is a way with Iray Server, so it's kind of another feature of Iray Server really, is that you can have your Iray viewport rendered in the computers, on the Iray server essentially. So when you go and switch over your viewport into Iray here, normally you would go and use your local GPUs to render this into Iray. But with this clustering service, with this clustering system, you can go and let that happen on the Iray server. So that's good news for Mac users who basically don't have that capability, or for those on laptops and things when things are underpowered and you still want to see a reasonably fast Iray preview. You can use this streaming thing that has worked at one point. It's just now that I'm demonstrating this thing is grayed out. So usually what would happen is you enable that, and then you can go and see that. So perhaps it has something to do with the queue that needs to be stopped. Let's work this out. And maybe I need to disconnect. And let's go and reconnect. There we go, perfect. So that works now. So I can go and enable this now. And that means everything that's available hardware on Iray Server will be used to render my viewport. So if I switch this over to Iray now, my local GPUs aren't gonna render this. Everything that's in Iray Server is going to render that. And you know, it's actually a little slower than the two GPUs that I've got going here. But just as a principle, just to show you, it does actually work, and it does also work from my Mac. I've tried this with my Mac too, and it does actually work, which is kind of crazy to see an Iray viewport with reasonable speed rendered on a Mac. That's kind of cool. I can show you the opposite if I disable that. Maybe disconnect. Oh my goodness, I shouldn't have done that. I think I've crashed something. Yes, I've crashed it. I've blown it up good. Hey, let's just see if we can get this back to life. I think the easiest option is to stop Iray Server. Yes, thank you. That's good. Thank you. Thank you, Iray Server. Good presentation. I'm glad we're ending on a high note here. That's what I think about it. I'll show you. So this is now disabled here. This is what I really wanted to show you. If I go and switch this to Iray now, my local system will render this. Oh, there's also the ground. I would like to see my ground, please. Draw ground there. Perfect. I like it. I like it much better. So this is what my local system does. And if I go and switch this off again and go into advanced here, I can enable this rendering, and that now means that my viewport can be rendered with Iray Server. And that means the moment I switch this over, it might take a little bit longer because all the data has to be sent over to Iray Server, and Iray Server has stopped working. What a shame. So in my tests, it actually did work. That's all I have. The crash window. That's all I have from Iray Server.